So that little phrase, knowing who you are, being more fully yourself, is not just a glib phrase. It's actually very difficult because a lot of us have been raised in these ways that discourage that inquiry. And so a lot of people don't know who they are. They only know what's expected of them, or they know they're unhappy with that, or it's not working, but they're not sure the way forward.
When we go into this journey of discovering our authentic experiences here, even maybe experiences that we were not that aware of that might emerge from these in-between spaces, where would you say that this kind of a therapeutical viewpoints or therapeutical tools end and spiritual insights begin? And is there a common ground for the two? Okay, so Vinay, here we are. First question, how are you feeling?
Yeah, I'm feeling pretty relaxed. This is the national holidays here in China, so everybody's got the big holiday this week.
Great, great. So in our talk, we're going to be exploring Gestalt and spiritual practices and meditational practices and spaces in between these practices. So you have had quite a remarkable path when it comes to the practice of psychotherapies and meditations. I believe you are landing on a 50-year mark on those things. So to start off with, can you share a little bit more about your path and what have been key moments or crossroads really that you are landing now here in this time and space?
Yeah, more than 50 years actually. So it's there's a lot I could say. I mean, I started when I was a teenager, so obviously that was a completely different phase of life, and I'm 66 now, so there's a lot of years that have a lot of things that have happened in the intervening years. I started meditation because I actually, before I started the meditation, I was learning this peer form of counseling called co-counseling or reevaluation counseling, which is rather than a professional expert, it's two people learning the skills and doing with each other. That was back in the early 70s. So that was my initial interest. And then when I was doing this exchange counseling with a woman, she was talking about meditation, having done meditation. As soon as she said that, I went, bing, oh, that sounds interesting. I definitely want to give that a try. So about a year later, I started meditating. And so really those have been twin interests of mine ever since. I
Yeah.
studied psychotherapy in my 20s, learned Gestalt therapy and did a mental health master's and such. So yeah, and the meditation and the practices have sort of been with me throughout that time. My main sort of psychotherapeutic modality is Gestalt, though I've learned a variety of others, but I sort of integrate them into the Gestalt approach. And
Yeah.
similarly, I'm practicing the same meditation I learned more than half a century ago. So I'm a kind of a stick with it kind of a guy when it comes to that sort of thing. Yeah, I'm not so much an eclectic person, though I do have very eclectic interests, and I you know like to read widely and encounter lots of different ideas. But in terms of my own practice, there's a sort of central core to both therapeutically and in terms of the spiritual side.
Yes, I will get back to that meditational practice, but as you have been like working a lot with Gestalt throughout the years, can you share a bit more about that and the cornerstones of Gestalt and really what differentiates it from other therapy methods?
Okay. It was one of the early humanistic therapies developed originally in the 1940s and the 1950s. So in many ways, it's quite foundational, and many therapies that come since, whether it be dialectical behavior therapy or a lot of others, draw on the sort of early Gestalt roots. Gestalt itself drew on the work of the Gestalt psychologists in the latter part of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century. And in fact, a lot of the Gestalt psychologists went to the same sort of lectures that Freud went to and studied with the same people. For instance, a guy called Brentano, amongst others. So Gestalt emerged firstly as a form of kind kind of academic psychology, research psychology, interested in our perception. And then Fritz Perls in the 1940s, he was originally a psychoanalyst. He developed psychoanalytic ideas and he integrated Gestalt ideas. And then in the 1950s, when he and his wife went to the US, they also incorporated a number of other approaches as well, including Zen and Taoism and such. But the roots also of Gestalt philosophically, before the Gestalt psychologists, go back probably more than 100 years to the tradition of phenomenology, which in this day and age sort of has different forms. Certainly there's phenomenological research, which people are now familiar with, which is contrasted with quantitative research. So a phenomenological study might study a single person, and that's considered valid for even a PhD. So the thing about the phenomenological method, which is important to understand and relevant to Gestalt and how it's different from other things, is that the phenomenological orientation is focused on people's subjective experience. So we're not trying to establish some sort of objective measure of what's right or what's wrong, or reference to an external set of values, or even psychological theories per se, how people work or their characters or anything like that. We're just interested in people's experience, and if it's sadness or anger or depression or whatever it is, divorce, falling in love, we're interested in how people experience that. And the fact is, everybody experiences that uniquely. We can look at similarities and we can draw conclusions about factors and call them by certain names, and that has some usefulness in terms of understanding the human mind and psyche and heart. The phenomenological approach, though, is really to study each person one at a time. So we're interested in uniqueness. So what that means is that we're not trying to relate things to some larger framework. Oh, this puts you in this category, or you're in this percent of the population. We're much just more interested in the uniqueness of each person's experience, which means that we don't try to analyze things. If you tell me a dream, I'm not going to relate your dream images to, someone else's ideas of what they mean, whether it be Freud or Jung or anyone else, or even cultural meanings. I'm much more interested in exploring those meanings experientially with you so you can discover it for yourself. So Gestalt is very much a kind of experiential learning process in that sense. And it involves two people, obviously, and a big component of Gestalt is what we call the relational. Nowadays, there's a sort of a recognized so-called relational turn in many therapies, where there's a lot more attention to the importance of the therapeutic relationship, because the research shows that really, as modalities or theories aside, what really matters is that therapeutic relationship. So Gestalt, we're interested in a particular kind of relationship, which is not so much vertical advice giving, guidance, facilitation, as a more horizontal relationship, which is between a person and a person, and in which your experience is important and the focus. My experience is also important as well, and I find ways to bring that in and to build relationship through doing that. So Gestalt has this component of authenticity or transparency, you can say, that is probably a little unique in many ways and distinguishes it, because it means that the therapist might talk about themselves, as relevant to what's supportive for the client. But I'm quite willing to share pretty much anything in my life. Just as I invite the client to be transparent, I'm also willing to be transparent. And then, yeah, Gestalt also, uh, it it's practical in the sense that we don't just talk about things. We say, okay, we've got clear what the theme is, what the issue is. Let's do something with it. Let's try something out. We call it the Gestalt experiment. So we give people the experience in the actual therapy session. Otherwise, you can just talk and talk a lot, and that, I think, has limited value. So those are some of the core elements of Gestalt. It certainly evolved since the 1940s, when Fritz Perls wrote his first book, Ego, Hunger, and Aggression, and it evolved through the 50s and the Zeitgeist of the 60s, and I learned Gestalt in the 80s, and it was still taught in a sort of an earlier format. But since then, there's been a lot of developments. We've paid a lot of attention to what we call the field, the wider picture, the context, a lot more attention to the importance of support in the relationship, because originally Gestalt was a kind of confrontive sort of therapy. So it's really evolved a lot, and over the years I practiced it, I've also participated in that evolution.
Yes, it's a new therapy method for me in the sense that I did not have a lot of knowledge about it before we met, and then I started to look into it a bit more, obviously being interested in human psychology and the mind and the consciousness and all these things. And what I understood about it is that it's like really creates this space for the therapist and the client to meet and then let like different things just unfold, like feelings and bodily sensations and energies and thought in this kind of very judgment free zone, in the
Mm, mm,
sense that they are not pinpointed to any experience either in the past or the future. So I can imagine that just stopping at this space in between spaces almost can be quite relieving for many people in our kind of fast-paced society, when people are very quick to link with certain
mm, mm,
experiences or
mm,
sensations with like certain events, and
mm,
even
mm,
have a thought that we experience good emotions and bad emotions, and
mm,
that the
mm,
bad emotions are ones which we
mm,
should not be experiencing
mhm.
for for some reason. And as a therapist, you also need to be quite conscious about how you are affecting the experience of the
Mm,
client, as you are
mm,
aware that you're a big part of the field
mm.
there. So can you tell me some matters on how you move to evolve the experience of the clients, and then again how you do not evolve that experience or impact that experience?
Well, um, as you say, there's a certain kind of spontaneity in the process. It's not just goal driven or this is what we're going to achieve or here's the outcome that we want to get to today, which leaves a lot of space for things to evolve organically. Now, what we're interested in, firstly, surfacing is what we call the figure. That is, where is the energy? What's the topic? What's the maybe unfinished business that is kind of crying out for being addressed? And so, firstly, we go through an initial process of trying to elicit that figure. And we're looking for energy, not just the stories, because sometimes people have kind of worn out stories. So I'm looking for where's the energy. Um, and having identified what we call that figure, which is something the client's interested in, is something I'm interested in. And I might initiate that as well. If I know the person well, I might bring up a topic. So it's not just drilling down into them. So that figure is, we say, the co-created figure is something we're both interested in. And then the process of exploring that is something we develop together. Now, a metaphor which could be apt is dancing. Like when you dance with someone, it's not just a cognitive thing. I mean, you might learn the steps or something, but it's a feeling, and they move a certain way, and you move a certain way, and you build up the connection between you. So, in a sense, Gestalt therapy is a bit like that, like dancing with the person. We're building up the connection, and they're moving in a direction and we're responding like any relationship, really. We're doing it in a very careful, a very refined, a very skillful way so that we're really building up the energy. And when someone's energy comes up, we'll meet that. And when it goes down, we'll meet that. So they really experience us being with them in that process. Now, when the client experiences me being with them in that process, then it builds both the trust and the strength of the relationship, and that provides a foundation for then exploring what we call this figure, this particular issue that is the most important thing that emerges in this moment between us. So it might have to do with something they brought to this session, or it might not. For instance, I was just working with a client today who was talking about a girl that he's kind of attached to, and the relationship didn't quite finish. And well, it's sort of finished, but he doesn't feel finished, and some time has gone by. So, of course, the issue is, how does he deal with the unfinished business? And he's a very smart guy, and so he's got a lot of thoughts in his mind, and he's thinking of her, and he's annoyed by that. So, firstly, in Gestalt, we tend to focus less on the cognitive and more on the emotional and the somatic. So I'm interested in, and or when you talk about this right now, what are your feelings? And so I'm eliciting feelings in the present, as you say, whether something's in the past or the future, we're going to bring it into the present to bring it alive and be able to work with it. So yeah, he's got these feelings that come up, and they're connected with, of course, some previous experiences of loss and relationship, which we also talk about a bit. The thing is, though, that because I know him well, I well, firstly, I invite him into this Gestalt experiment. I say, well, okay, if you're going to talk to this woman, what would you want to say to her? And he's shy and kind of it's difficult for him because he's a nice guy and he doesn't like to hurt people's feelings or upset them or something. So he's a little bit tentative, and I'm encouraging him to be a bit more bold and to really say the truth of what he feels. So even though she's not actually there, the practice, the experiment, and the session is very real because he comes up against his own limitations. Now, what I know about him is that he's a nice guy, and of course that goes a long way. And at the same time, in Gestalt, we're interested in polarities. So you could say any pole that we identify with is an opposite pole. So he's a nice guy, so he's not rude or blustery or pushy. Now, of course, people don't like rude, blustery, or pushy people. And yet, if you're too nice, then you don't really come out with what the guts of it is. You're not really being sharp and clear. You're just beating around the bush. So I invited him into this other polarity where he's a bit more blunt and direct and says exactly what he thinks and feels, which was, risky for him. And that's what we're interested in, taking people into a bit of risk or something that's difficult. We provide support so it's not too difficult, but enough risk that he can come to his edge and he can have a new experience. And so he starts to discover this, bolder part of him that can be really much more truthful. So that's built out of not just what he presents, but my knowledge of him and the ways that I can support him and invite him and challenge him to come to that edge. And then when he's at that edge, give him the support he needs to stay there, because that's what we call the growing edge. That's where the learning takes place.
Mm.
So psychotherapy, Gestalt, is the art of building the ground, eliciting the figure, and then we say ripening that figure in a way which contains the right mix of support and challenge.
Yeah, yes, it's really cool what unfolds from the space when it opens
Mm,
up. I kind of feel like
mm,
I want to try this also. I'm getting excited when you're talking about it. Oh, yes. And I can imagine that a lot of people come to therapy because they want to like fix something about themselves, so to speak, that there's something that they feel that is disturbing their progress in life and they maybe want to get rid of it. But
mm.
as your perspective as a therapist, can we actually fix ourselves, or is it really more about just letting the unfolding happen and sort of traveling through the fire?
Mm. Well, I do think there's some traveling through the fire to be done, though, it needs to be done with the right kind of support. Your phrase about getting rid of things, you're right. A lot of people come implicitly or explicitly wanting to get rid of things. And my response from the Gestalt position and my own position is, yeah, I don't think it's that useful to get rid of anything. I mean, what's useful is to know yourself, know who you are, and build ground. And as you understand yourself and your limitations and your fears, and as you get support to stay at that edge and grow, which is very much what therapy is about, then you grow into being more fully yourself. So the idea of cutting away anything, I think, is not particularly helpful, although people, yeah, often have those agendas. And in terms of, yeah, solving problems, of course, that's what brings people to therapy, some sort of unhappiness or something that they're stuck with that they need help with. And, I understand that that's genuine. And at the same time, my interest is more what I call existential. This question of, well, who are you and how do you manifest in your life? And the more that you understand that, then the question of getting rid of something or fixing something becomes secondary to the question of being yourself. And of course, there's, you know, a lot of discouragement from being yourself in the families or whatever. Generally, kids, for the most part, are not really encouraged to be themselves. They're encouraged to fit in and be polite, or, you know, be respectful, or be quiet, or be study well, or all the things that society and the school and the parents or the family would like them to see them be. And that doesn't always leave room for the unique kid to find out who they are. So that little phrase, knowing who you are, being more fully yourself, is not just a glib phrase. It's actually very difficult because a lot of us have been raised in these ways that discourage that inquiry. And so a lot of people don't know who they are. They only know what's expected of them, or they know they're unhappy with that, or it's not working, but they're not sure the way forward, especially here in China, but I think in a lot of other places as well.
Yeah, this is something that I've been thinking about and what we talked about in one of the other podcasts also. This experience of us going through life as a human being, but through this kind of a societal programming system that it almost feels like people are being programmed in some parts to suppress their true self, like from the system. And what I mean by that is that this healthy emotional regulation and experiencing your authentic self and like letting things emerge as they are in a very judgment-free way and traveling through that experience is not really something that is taught to us in any school system, at least not here in Finland. And it's almost even like, do you disagree?
Well,
Maybe.
no, I'm shaking my head because it's just, I agree. And the irony for me in listening you say that is people say, oh, Finland's got the best education system in the world. So when you say not here in the system, I'm like, oh my God, well, if Finland's got the best education system in the world and it's not there, then yeah, clearly it's missing.
Yeah, no, it's okay. I will unravel that this is not a part of the system here. Perhaps it's more about literacy skills or some other
Yeah,
easily measurable objective, but
yeah.
perhaps that's also the reason that this kind of a growing
Mm,
into this authentic human being you are is not a very measurable aspect in
mm,
the sense, like you
mm,
said, that
mm,
each experience is very unique.
mm,
And so perhaps for that reason, it is also a bit scary for people,
mm,
including the teachers themselves. If they if they
mm.
don't know really who they are either, then how are you
Yeah.
going to teach like a young
Mm,
person that?
mm,
However, I do feel and hope that there is a change coming now, that obviously a lot of our systems are changing anyway around us and the working environments and societies and
mm,
so forward. So we are kind of closing in on a point that people will almost be forced to look in the mirror or look deep within the
mm,
self and find peace there, because obviously our surroundings in the world are not that
mm,
peaceful
mm,
right
mm, mm,
now. And well, when we go into this journey of discovering our authentic experiences here, even maybe experiences that we were not that aware of that might emerge from these in between spaces, where would you say that this kind of a therapeutical viewpoints or therapeutical tools end and spiritual insights begin? And is there a common ground for the two?
mm. Yeah, well, that's an interesting and a big question. One way I find it useful to think about or understand the spiritual, because it's a very broad word and people use it a lot of different ways, and it's so broad that it's almost amorphous. It could almost mean anything. I go for a walk on around the stream, and like what, and it's people associate that with a spiritual experience, but then what makes it spiritual? So, one way I think is useful that I've developed to talk about it is using three different lenses. So, one lens is the cognitive thinking beliefs, and we were talking before about the the way that people adopt, values or beliefs that they're taught by society, and authenticity in some ways, certainly from a Gestalt point of view, requires re-examining those beliefs, chewing them over, finding what fits for me. So on the spiritual, that's also very true. There's particular kinds of beliefs that we could call spiritual beliefs, and you can read books about them, you can hear talks about them, and people think about them, and they develop bodies of uh, beliefs and such around those spiritual ideas. So that's one whole realm that we can refer to as the spiritual. And then there's another realm which is about how that gets translated into practice. We could call that spiritual practices. So obviously there's prayer or meditation or walking the labyrinth. There's lots of different things people do that we can call spiritual practices because they're practiced with a spiritual intent, or they're linked to that body of theory and ideas, in some ways trying to live out some of those concepts or principles or values. And the idea of the spiritual practices is often to go deeper, to have a deeper experience. So it's not just a cognitive experience, but it's something fuller. And when people practice those experiences intensively, they go to a 10-day Vipassana or whatever that is, then they go deeper. And then what's deeper? So then that's the third area that I think is useful, which is to talk about spiritual experiences. So if we go deeper into ourselves, then at some point we may have that spiritual experience, whether it's intentional, you're sitting there meditating or praying and you have some spiritual experience, or often unintentional in the course of a life. People often have these unexpected, spontaneous type of experiences, which you could call spiritual experiences, which are certainly have certain characteristics in common. They have a certain kind of depth or truthfulness, or they transcend space or time. There's been some interesting studies done on this. So those spiritual experiences are really often have a big impact on people. They really can be transformative. They can alter their belief systems. They can, or if they have a belief system, and it illuminates the belief system, so it's not just thinking about something, but it's kind of really knowing it. So those spiritual experiences are quite profound. And so the three of these things are connected together. You have a set of beliefs, and you have maybe some experiences which deepen that, and you do practices which also help connect up the beliefs and the experiences. So if we firstly characterize those three different ways, then we can look at any particular spiritual system, religion, or whatever it is, the mystical practice, and we can look at those three ingredients. So that helps us sort of define what spirituality is. At least each person has their own definition according to their own belief systems or their own practices or their own experiences. And then we can look at, okay, well, how does psychotherapy, the practice of looking at the mind and the body and the emotions, how does that fit with a spiritual belief system or a set of spiritual practices or spiritual experiences? Um, Now, in some ways, the two domains are somewhat set apart because the nature of spiritual experience, if we drill down, it usually has some sort of, you could say, transcendent form to it. People feel larger than life. It's like they're on the top of the mountain. They have a clear vision of what's going on, or things become illuminated. So there's a sense of transcendence or great depth associated with that. And that state of being or experience is very different than our normal cognitive, emotional, somatic selves, which is what psychotherapy is concerned with. So in a way, in psychotherapy, we're not really working usually with spiritual experience. However, if someone's had a spiritual experience, then psychotherapy can be very useful because they can talk about it in a safe way where they're not going to be judged, where it's going to be explored. Of course, you need a therapist who's not going to put negative judgments or say, oh, well, that sounds like psychotic break or whatever. They're going to just listen to the person's actual experience. But if a therapist is willing to do that, then it can be very supportive because there's not a lot of places people can actually talk about those spiritual experiences. Even in spiritual groups, it's not always permissible or approved to talk about those spiritual experiences. So we can certainly examine those in therapy and address what they mean or what the repercussions are, that can be useful exploration. Um, Therapy itself is a kind of a practice. It's a practice of thinking about things. It's a practice of feeling more deeply. It's a practice of trying out new behaviors. So, uh, however, is practicing in a different kind of a way. So the practices don't necessarily overlap, though some of them can and do, especially in this day and age where mindfulness has been, scientifically verified and is therefore approved. And a lot of people from a lot of different therapy schools use mindfulness in some form or another. So, it can be incorporated into therapy. We can use it to help people become still. It can be practiced as part of the therapy or given as an adjunct to therapy. So that's a spiritual practice, which certainly can dovetail into psychotherapy. And for probably the last 10 years, particularly, there's been a lot of focus and research and experimentation with how do you bring mindfulness into therapy. As I said,
Mm.
Gestalt was one of the early sort of humanistic therapies, and Gestalt incorporates within it a sort of a mindfulness practice. It's not a spiritual mindfulness practice because we're not trying to transcend things, but it is a mindfulness practice in terms of being present. And in fact, being with your body allows you to center in the present moment, which is a lot of what we do in Gestalt. So yeah, Gestalt has that, you could say, mindfulness quality to it. And certainly Fritz Perls was interested in Taoism and Zen, and he went to Japan to study Zen a little bit. And so some of those concepts and practices are indeed embedded in Gestalt. The other thing I was going to say, just in terms of these three frames to finish that up, is that the trickiest frame is the frame of beliefs, because that's where people often conflict for having different spiritual beliefs, and there can indeed be intense conflicts about that. Sometimes people are very attached to their beliefs and hold on to them very tightly and rigidly. And in a psychotherapeutic context, yeah, we need to understand that. We need to be interested in people's beliefs, not necessarily argue against them, but possibly help them explore them. So again, there's some chewing over process going on. Psychotherapy itself doesn't implicitly have a belief system about spiritual things necessarily. Gestalt certainly doesn't like to work with beliefs about anything. We're just interested in exploring whatever the belief someone has and helping them discern and assimilate and see what makes sense for them. So, a therapeutic process can actually help people to examine their beliefs and figure out what's true for them rather than teaching them or instructing them, because that's usually what happens in a spiritual context is they're being taught or instructed or guided. But
Mm.
at least in Gestalt therapy, we don't like to do that. We're more interested in exploration.
Yeah, I would see spirituality very much this kind of evolvement through spaces, also sometimes through spaces and time, and very difficult to put a framework on that. What interests me is that since Gestalt also explores this kind of the unknown, or what we may not know right now, but what we might know in an hour or so, like depending on the length of the session with your client, is that has it ever occurred so that a client would come to a session for therapy and end up having a somewhat of a spiritual experience through this unfolding?
Quite describe people's experience in a classical sense of a spiritual experience, because, yeah, like I say, that's often more associated with a transcendent experience. I mean, of course, if you do a sort of hypnotic process, sometimes you can take people into deeper layers of the mind and they can go deeper into that sense. And in an induction, people can have sometimes a more illuminated experience, or, go into like a sort of imagine a world, but I still wouldn't really describe that as spiritual, at least in my understanding. Um, I think the answer is partly can be given from a different frame, which is one of the core philosophies here in China is Taoism and the Tao Te Ching and Lao Tzu. And so this philosophy is a very interesting philosophy because it's a very non-grasping philosophy. It's a philosophy that doesn't have heavy-duty beliefs or even prescribed practices. It's very open-ended in that sense, and yet it has a kind of coherence to it, a particular flavor, a particular way of understanding life or being in life. And I've met quite a few Taoist sort of teachers here, and they do have some sort of quality to them that's hard to pin down, but you could say there's some spiritual quality there. The reason I'm mentioning this is because I think Gestalt therapy, especially, has a kind of a Taoist, you could say, or a Taoist practice in that we're, yes, not grasping, we're flowing with, we're noticing where the energy surges. And Taoism is particularly about being with nature or people's nature and not resisting it, not controlling it, not coming down and trying to make things a certain way. Everything in the Tao Te Ching talks about that, like, the way that water flows is one of the key metaphors there. Um, so when I work in this sort of spontaneous, emergent way without agendas, without overly controlling, bring myself authentically in, then at times there's a particular quality of flow. Like there's that guy Csikszentmihalyi, however you say his name, but wrote the book on flow. There's a number of people that talked about flow and how do we get in the flow. And when an artist or a sports person, for instance, is in that flow state, then things just kind of unfold in this sort of natural, organic way that is not, there's control and skill, but there's not sort of grasping. So when Gestalt is practiced in this way, as it is, in a sense, that's the core of a Gestalt process. So when we do that, then we do get a particular quality of flow in the session, which is, I mean, I don't like to use the word too frivolously, but it's a bit magical. Like things just emerge, and there's like a gears moving together. We call it type therapeutic sequencing, where just one thing moves on to the next, and things can flow in this very organic way. And that experience, whilst it's not a sort of classic transcendent spiritual experience, you could say has a spiritual quality to it, perhaps, because it really is being about being present, present with yourself, present with life, and present with your life energy. So at least on a sort of a manifest human level, yeah, I think that that's got a particular quality to it, which we could describe as spiritual. But that's, I think, as close as it gets.
Yeah. Yes. And of course, it's also very difficult to describe what experience another person is having in the instance, even if you're in the same space and kind of moving through the field together. But yeah, I would see flow as a kind of very this beautiful, somewhat magical, as you said, landing like really
Mm,
deep within the
mm,
self and then operating from that space, like in this
mm,
ultimate state of
mm,
connectedness with
mm,
like I see that if you are very connected with the self, you are somewhat automatically very connected with like others and the environment around you
mm,
also,
mm,
because
mm,
in a sense, we are all the same here. Like, I don't really think that we are that separated from each other. But to explore a bit on like this very, on the other hand, a very different kind of experience, I would believe that people also may come to therapy for is a sense of dissociation, a sense of being very disconnected from the self or our feelings and thought
mm,
processes, and
mm,
even at times losing oneself, perhaps being like in this very productivity based system for a long time, being very
mm,
focused on the working life and so forward, and slowly becoming disconnected um, from the self. I am very interested in a certain experience of dissociation, which is referred to in both, well, different kind of spiritual experiences in meditations, but then also in the lucid dreaming I'm interested in. We're not going to go so far into that now. But this particular experience is the void, which is kind of a sense of nothingness that I have read a bit about. And it's something that advanced meditators journey towards or want to experience, that you have like a moment that you feel that the self, like the ego-driven self, is gone, directly
Right.
speaking.
Mm,
So
mm,
yeah,
mm,
and people can experience it quite differently. They can experience like a sense of like blackness in that state, even if they're
mm,
meditating or in the dreaming realm, or they can experience that there is like some light or something like this, but
mm,
nonetheless, like no imagery, like there's no body, there's no like identity in that sense,
mm,
and being completely detached from it.
mm, mm,
Now,
mm,
dissociation is what can be determined as a disease. That you have had this kind of
mm, mm,
experience,
mm,
like you're
mm,
psychologically sick or
mm,
physically sick. However, when
mm,
you look at it through meditational practices, it becomes like uh,
mm,
space to go through this transfiguration process, that you almost leave certain parts of you behind and
mm,
build from there. How do you see this sense of nothingness if somebody
mm.
would be experiencing that?
Well, I'm going to say it depends. It's a good question and an important topic because dissociation from a psychological point of view usually is in response to trauma and is usually a way people cope and in fact consolidate themselves so they don't completely lose their mind. So dissociation can be a very kind of healthy response to a highly traumatic situation. And then it becomes a kind of way of being where people automatically disassociate when there's some fear or shock or sense of danger or something that might even be smaller. So on that psychological level, it can be understood as a coping mechanism, which then, of course, brings its own problems because um, if you're disassociated too much of the time, then you're not really connected with other people, yourself, or the environment, and there's a sense of dislocation, and that can produce all sorts of problems, whether it be interior problems, sense of not having a center, not enough of a sense of core self, or a sense of experience of dislocation in relationship. Psychologically, yeah, disassociation can be very problematic in its effects, although we can understand it's necessary sort of, let's say, defense mechanism, if you want to put it that way. And so psychologically, we're going to work with it in particular ways. We're going to work with it in terms of establishing safety and building relationship and helping people address whatever that trauma is that was overwhelming, and to do it in small pieces so it can be digested and assimilated so they can stay with the experience, whether everyday living or a particular stressful circumstance, without disassociating. And a big part of that is the body and helping them come into the body and stay in the body and stay grounded. Um, so there's a lot of psychotherapy knowledge and techniques and approaches around the whole topic of disassociation. And there's some techniques such as hypnosis, think of Ericksonian hypnosis, where you're intentionally disassociating someone because you want to separate them out from a particular state that they've been in to allow them the fluidity to discover another state. But that's a very carefully managed process that is very intentional and has a therapeutic orientation and needs to be done in a very skilled way. In terms of what you're talking about, let's say the other side, let's call it the spiritual side. Well, yes, what I was describing is that component of the three of spiritual experience often, as I said, is described as a transcendent kind of experience, which suggests that you are transcending your normal experience, that you are, in a sense, disassociated from the small identity of self and able to identify with a much larger sense of self. which is a kind of dissociative experience, but it's different than a trauma dissociation. It's a dissociation which has a sense of joy or expansion or noesis, of deep truthfulness, and is kind of nourishing and fulfilling, rather than being frightening and dislocating. So, they are two different kinds of disassociation in that respect, and it's important to distinguish between them. Um, Unfortunately, various kind of psychological authorities, let's say, psychiatrists perhaps, who are on the lookout for someone with psychosis in the sense of fragmentation, which is kind of dysfunctional internally and in their lives, might not be able to differentiate a
Yeah.
spiritual experience, which has certain similarities, but is fundamentally different and is a lot more positive generally. They might not be able to distinguish that, which is then unfortunate because then they treat a spiritual experience as if it's simply a psychotic, disassociative, trauma type of experience, which is not helpful. It can be, in fact, damaging in various ways. And unfortunately, that does happen where we have a medical model, which is sort of the highest authority in terms of mental health and judges whether people are fit or sane. And unfortunately, they're generally not that trained in being able to differentiate a spiritual state from a psychotic state. Um, so, with those caveats, I would say yes, a spiritual experience can have that profound depth and have some sense of floating in nothingness, which is different than a psychotic person's floating in nothingness, which is distressing and overwhelming and at least to enemy, whereas a person having a spiritual experience floating in nothingness leads to a sense of enlightenment and complete sense of peace and calm. So it's important to differentiate those two things. My own personal view is that in the realm of spirituality, it is important to have someone who is guiding you, who understands that world and is able to make sense of it and explain to you what is going to be helpful and what's going to be less helpful. Um, so I do encourage people to find some sort of spiritual teacher or something going into that area. I don't think it's just something that is advantageous to do all on your own. So I think support's important, and then it can help. It's also an example of what you're describing of what I was saying about the cognitive and integrating that, because when you have an experience and you're not really understanding what it is, that's where the cognitive bit of spiritual knowledge can actually be helpful in making sense of the experience, because you have this big experience or you're not sure how to digest it, then some of that cognitive can say, oh, well, this is what's happening, or here's what you do next, or something, and provide a bit of a framework. That can be very helpful. So it's interesting because where the cognitive can just completely distract you from spiritual experience by just making you way too heady and analyzing things down to the nth degree in a way that perhaps is not really that helpful, it can be really appropriate to bring it in at those times. And if a psychological practitioner has some understanding of spiritual principles, then and they're able to recognize the difference, then that's a place where they indeed might be able to support the person in that kind of a way.
Yeah, I believe that there is, and perhaps there will be even more of a question and a need for like psychotherapists in the future who have, yes, a strong scientific understanding of cognitions and how the cognitive side work, but
Mm,
also an understanding on kind of the greater aspect of being a human being and the spiritual side in that, because it's a bit of a shame that sometimes it's seen that these two are very separate from each
mm,
other and kind of against each other, like the scientific and then the aspect which is not so easily
mm,
proven by
mm,
science, and that like you can't have both, that they would be
mm,
contradicting. I see
mm,
it personally more as supportive if you have happen to have a somewhat analytical mind, and yet a logical and very like interested mind on different aspects, that you can use them to understand like human being, even as in like layers, that okay, we have this psychological understanding, we have the mind and the brain and our body and how that works, and then around that we have this greater spiritual side that it's not so
Mm,
easily
mm,
determined. But moving on to the final theme, this very interesting conversation, and the time clock is ticking. So moving on to the final theme is more on understanding about power. So you you have undergone the doctoral program in this power dynamics, or was
mm,
interpersonal power dynamics, something
mm, mm,
like this. So now kind of moving now from this psychological and spiritual towards our operation in our daily dynamics, like what is power for you? What does that mean?
mm. Right. Well, that's quite a complex question. I guess what's probably relevant to reduce it down to a nutshell is the question of power differential. And there's some very clear power differentials that exist at a workplace or within families, between parents and children. You know, we don't have to even try to define power to just say there is a power differential. One person has more power than the other. The employer has the power to fire you or instruct you to do things, and a parent has the power to give out rewards or punishments. So those are pretty straightforward examples of power that don't require too sophisticated a definition. So I'm sort of more moving towards an operational view, which is in looking at situations where there's power differentials, particularly how can we understand what Sita Barstow calls the right use of power. She wrote a book of that name, and then she's established an organization called the Right Use of Power. And I think it's a good title because it is thematically, practically what's important, which is that whenever I'm in a position of power, how can I use that well? How can I be aware of the impact and the responsibilities? Now, of course, there's obvious responsibilities to go with the role of power, to manage things, to be responsible for our financial bottom line or the welfare of employees, to take a few examples. I guess what's the issue? There's a few things at issue that are particularly salient. One of them is a very interesting piece of research that was originally done written up in 2003 by Dasha Keltner et al., talking about what's called approach and inhibition. And I'll mention this briefly. People can look up the reference, and it's a great seminal article. And then since then, there's been like hundreds and hundreds of studies been done from one angle or another confirming it. But basically, what they found is that there's a complex biological, psychological, physiological mechanism, behavioral mechanism that we have, which gets triggered. And if you're in some position of relative power, what gets triggered is what's called approach. And if you're in a position of less power, what gets triggered is called inhibition. And basically, what that means is that when you're in power, you approach, you initiate, you see things in larger light, you overestimate your capacity, you're more confident. Just with the power role, whatever the personality is, these are effects. Similarly, when you're in a lesser power role, you tend to automatically step into inhibition. You say less, bite your tongue, you're in a more fearful position, you're in a more retiring position. So the roles trigger these kind of experiences. And so then these experiences kind of reinforce the power roles and the power differential. So I think it's very useful to understand that. And I was working at one point with a CEO who was, he was very well intentioned, and he was actually working in the health field, and he really wanted to help people, and he established his health company. And, I think he was doing a lot of good. And there were problems,
Mm.
which I could see very clearly in terms of power, both within the organization itself and between him and the staff, and also issues to do with the clients and him in his CEO role, etc. So when I brought these to his attention, oh, it's a dangerous thing to do. Uh, he was a bit uncomprehending. He's like, well, people can just speak up, or nobody said anything, or he was oblivious to this approach inhibition dynamic. He didn't seem to grasp that when people are in a lesser role of power, including professionals, seasoned professionals that were working for him, these were not young interns. These were people who had a lot of authority and knowledge and expertise in their own life. And yet, in the position of lesser power, they move into this approach sort of scenario. And he just didn't realize or couldn't grasp that his position of power gave him this sort of aura, this mantle that was more than just, well, you can talk to me about such things. I said, no, people don't want to talk to you. They're afraid to talk to you. You can fire them. And so I gave him that article. I don't think he read it. So the reason I'm talking about this is because I think people in positions of power, particularly, it behooves them or us when we're in that position to know about and be interested in the effects of having power. I mean, there's a thing about BMW drivers, just to completely generalize for the moment, but people who drive BMWs have more power, more money than people who don't drive BMWs, just to make a simple distinction. And when people in BMWs and they have more money and status and power, they tend to drive more aggressively. They pay attention to pedestrians less. There's been studies done on this. So it's not just that they're bad people or that they're arrogant or big egos. Same thing with sexual approach. So when someone's in a position of power, they have an overinflated sense of their own attractiveness or their own capacity to, perhaps take a sexual interest in someone who's in a lesser position of power. There's not just bad men or, you know, patriarchy per se. Of course, that's part of it, but more fundamentally, it's about power. Even women in that position also step in some ways into this. And so they found, as they did a study about, sexual behavior of people in positions of power, and they found this. It's kind of the role, it's the situation that thrusts us into this overconfidence, and it even goes down to a physiological level, to the hormones and cortisol or other hormones which we produce. They're affected by these positions. Taking it away from any kind of even psychological or spiritual component, this is just like some core, almost pecking order, mammalian, reptilian brain thing that goes on. So I think it's very valuable for people to understand something about this, and to understand that it's not just about bad actors or people being, acting in bad ways. It's that power has this effect. And therefore, if that's true, what do we need to do to educate people about this, to support them, to inform them, particularly as they step into positions of power? One of the things I'll just say, because I know we need to finish soon, briefly about my research, was that because I was researching middle managers in a variety of companies in China, Australia, and the US, and amongst all the managers that I interviewed, none of them was given equipped with the knowledge or skills of dealing with power. A few of them did some little leadership training courses. Okay, there's a little bit of that. But fundamentally, the things I'm talking about, and there's a lot else that goes into understanding how power works, they weren't informed of that or equipped with that. Now, the people I interviewed, by their own trial and error learning, had figured out, and a lot of them said, you can't force anyone to do anything. I mean, you can, but it has consequences, and therefore the best way of managing is to work with people and to, draw them out. So these were quite smart managers that I actually were the ones that I interviewed. They weren't heavy-handed, heavy-fisted people. And they had figured out something about the nature of power. But I think that if people are more equipped, it's going to help. And if mechanisms are built into companies whereby knowledge of how power works is there, then some of the excesses might be reduced. Some of the terrible things we see about the way power is used might be altered, because when power is used badly, obviously it can really hurt people, and many people have that experience of being on the other end of that, and that's a lot of the reason people come to therapy, because someone in some
Mm.
position of power, parent or otherwise, has done something to them in that position of power which has hurt or damaged them. So it's obviously relevant in terms of its impact everywhere.
Yes, it kind of interlinks nicely with the first subject, like going to therapy, like from this impact of power. But it's actually a tremendously interesting subject also, how you described it. And then I started to think about it, that we have this interaction between, if we have a role of power, then
Mm,
we have the experience of power, and
mm,
our experience of power will start to feed probably even more the role of power, because it's kind of starting to cause these different psychological consequences, even physiological
mm,
consequences,
mm,
like you said, which I would believe that then you start acting a certain way, it could like push
mm.
you to get even more power in your role. And we get
Yeah.
back to this. And then I think maybe one thing, if we're talking then about awareness of that power, is that all of us have shadow self. I always
Mm-hmm.
like to bring these dark dark
Mm,
subjects like the
mm,
void and
mm,
the shadows and stuff.
mm.
But
Sure.
all of us have this shadow self, which can be more, and is probably more destructive for ourselves and for others. And I believe that that shadow self is something that can become stronger and stronger if you have more and more power, because there's like less and less limits that you see that you
Mm,
can and cannot do, like you said, with the
mm,
drivers and the pedestrians and so forward. But at some turning points, I suppose, in that sense, power can turn into weakness if your own awareness starts to diminish of the reality that surrounds you. So it's a very interesting loop that could surely be talked about much more. But
mm,
what do you say that people in the position of power, in order not to turn into this more destructive
mm,
way of being, would be beneficial to like
mm,
pinpoint their awareness on
mm,
in
mm.
themselves?
Well, I mentioned the Cedar Barstow. She's a current edition of a book is called Living in the Power Zone. I really recommend it to anyone to get and read. It's very helpful, very practical. One of the things I'll pick from that is she talks about percentages. She says that someone who has less power is 100% responsible for what they do. Just because they have less power, they still have 100% responsibility. However, she said the person with more power has 150% responsibility, which means that not only do they have full responsibility, but they have more than full responsibilities. That is, they have a responsibility to look at the big picture, to take into consideration impact, and when something happens, when something goes wrong, it's not just like, well, I'm responsible and you're responsible. The person with more power indeed has more responsibility. And so that 150% principle, I think, is a useful one, is a useful guide. It's something that can inform people in, if they got power, into thinking about how they deal with conflicts or difficult situations and what it is that they need to do. So they need to have this extra mile that they go in terms of understanding the people under them and understanding the impact of their role and the privileges that go with it. So that's one of the principles that I'd pull from her wonderful list.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you. So, final question now. Um, You have obviously traveled quite a remarkable path, and I would see you as a person of power. You have had a lot of experience in leadership and in different roles and so forward. However, you mentioned in the beginning of this podcast that there has been a certain meditational practice you've been
Hmm.
keeping up with for the past
Hmm.
50 years. So
Mm.
now, as a person of power, you can share this meditational practice. I'm very interested what it is.
Sure. Well, I follow a yogic system. My teacher, my guru, he was born in 1926, died in 1990. No, he was born in 1921. And so he came from the Indian episteme, and he drew on those Indian yogic traditions. And he also drew on what are called the tantric traditions. Now, today in Western society, when you say tantra, people think of kind of sexuality, but tantra is like goes back 7,000 years, and the majority of the tantric practices have nothing to do with sex or sexuality. They're more about spiritual transcendence. So he drew on those roots, and in the middle of the 20th century, he kind of took those ancient yogic principles and practices, and he tied them together into a framework that can be sort of practically practiced by ordinary people in modern life. So those are the practices and the philosophy that I have adopted and found quite useful. The name of the organization that he founded is Anandamaga. Um, the yogic framework, which is known probably to a lot of people, is called Ashtanga Yoga, which is the eightfold frame. And I guess what's some of the things that are significant in that is that it includes asanas, which are the hatha yoga, the physical yoga postures, which many people identify as yoga, but is only 1/8 of the whole picture from a classical point of view. Also includes several different kinds of meditation practices, pratyahara, which is the concentration of mind, pranayama, which is the breath control, and what's called dhyan, which is a particular very deep process of flowing the mind. But what's also interesting is part of the Eightfold Path are two other wings, which are called in Sanskrit jama and niyama, which are basically descriptions of, you could say, a set of yogic ethics. So there's 5 principles in each, and some of them are familiar sort of universal principles: don't harm, don't steal, that type of thing. And there's other principles which are kind of interesting, like service or contentment, called santosh. So it has various principles in it. And I think what's interesting and relevant is that traditionally, in very traditional terms, if someone really wanted to learn meditation and they went to a guru, an ashram, then they would often be told, before you learn meditation, you have to practice jhana niyama. In other words, you have to practice these ethical principles in your life. And sometimes for many years, sometimes 2, 3, 6 years before they were entitled to learn meditation. And I think there's something that's kind of valuable about that in our fast modern world, where you can open your phone and get meditation timer, and you can get 100 different teachers telling you 100 different things and try lots of different meditations, which is great. I mean, it's wonderful. It's a world which opens up possibilities and experiences. However, I think that old practice, there's something to stop and consider about that, because it says that it's not just about meditation transcendence. Although those practices are important, it's also about how you live your life. And in, the millennia before psychotherapy, those ethical principles were part of, how do you live in a balanced and adjusted way in relationship in the world. So that provides a sort of a counterbalance between the transcendent and the spiritual, which the spiritual practices are primarily about, and the kind of groundedness, which is also necessary as part of spirituality. So those 10 principles I think are quite interesting. I mean, of course, people follow different ethical codes in Buddhism, and each religion or practice has its own kind of ethical principles. So whatever they are, they're usually fairly coherent with each other. I think they're important, not from a moralistic point of view, doing the right thing in terms of moralistic judgment, but
Mm.
more in terms of an inner guidance of how do I live my life in a way which follows these kind of principles and helps me live in a balanced and whole and coherent and integrated way. So I do appreciate, this Ashtanga yoga framework because of that, because it incorporates that and privileges those principles as well as meditation practices. Now I know there's other systems that have their own version of that, but I'm talking about the system that I follow. And this other aspect, the tantric aspect, if it's not a sexual thing, then what is it? Well, uh, Tantra originally, at least as the folklore that I follow says, was developed by Shiva, who, although he's one of the pantheon of, Hindu gods, actually was grounded in an historical figure who lived almost 7,000 years ago, a very long time ago, and whose life is kind of interesting because at that time, the Aryans were moving from the north into India, and you had the local tribes, the Dravidians and the Mongols, who were dark skinned, and the Aryans were light skinned. And, you had them sort of conjuncting, they came down from the Himalayas, and there was a sort of a clash of cultures, of values. The Aryans brought with them the Vedas, and then there was the kind of local, more mystical knowledge of the local people. And so Shiva was at a time when these two civilizations were kind of cohering, clashing, and such. And he actually married a wife from both of those, civilizations. Um, so he brought together both some of that sort of native shamanistic, mystical yogic tradition and some of this sort of Vedic, Sanskrit, more erudite sort of tradition. And when he brought them together, he formed this system of spirituality called Tantra. So, it's got a long lineage and it has certain kind of characteristics. So, for instance, there's a certain kind of engagement with the world. So, although spirituality is about transcendence, Tantra is really about this. I was talking about the integration between the transcendent and the immanent, so that you have a kind of a coherence that results from the balance of those two things. So, Tantra is not just about sort of retreating to the mountains or the caves, it's very much about living your daily life, manifesting these kind of principles, which, is pretty challenging in today's fast paced world with computers and everything else. So there's a kind of a spirit of Tantra, which is really engagement and involvement and not shying away from the world. And I appreciate that as well about the framework that I come from. And I guess the last thing I'll say about it is that my particular teacher, his name was Sri Sri Nandamurti, he gave almost equal weight to the spiritual teachings and encouraging people to pursue that, and to paying attention to the society around us, to socioeconomic and geopolitical issues. And in his day, in the sort of the mid part of the 20th century, he was very concerned in India with issues such as caste and the divisiveness of the caste system, the dowry system, the way it disadvantaged women, the way that widows were treated. So he was quite a champion in that context of women's rights and of thinking about alternative ways to structure a society. So he was a unique spiritual teacher. There's not too many like him, maybe Aurobindo, maybe a few others who have really thought about society in a broader sense, mostly spiritual teachers, keep their focus on the spiritual and let people handle the world themselves. But he had a lot to say about the importance of socioeconomic development and how can you integrate spiritual principles into that. So personally, that's something I appreciate about the framework that I follow.
Great, yes. Very comprehensive. My mind is going like through this whole journey with you to the different places, spiritual practices and times, and it's absolutely wonderful. And yeah, I bet it's very good to find your own practice in that sense that you're able to really integrate your own awareness in this
Mm,
day-to-day life and not
mm,
get swept away by everything that's happening around us all the
mm,
time,
mm.
every day. I'm so forward. But yes, thank you so much for this conversation and great. Look forward to having another one, hopefully in the future.
Wonderful. Thanks very much, Ruth. Enjoyed talking to you today. Appreciated your questions. Mm.